There are people who feel the need to leave their face floating in every digital corner, as if disappearing from the display window for a single day meant ceasing to exist. And then there are others, the ones who move through social media like a house with the curtains closed. Not because they have no life, but because they understood that not everything alive needs a storefront. In a world where so many confuse exposure with importance, it is worth asking an uncomfortable question. How much of what you show comes from freedom, and how much from your fear of not being seen? Most people misunderstand those who do not post their photos. They assume it is insecurity, shyness, or something odd, because of course these days it almost seems offensive not to offer yourself up for other people's consumption. But many times the opposite is true. The person who no longer needs to show themselves has stopped depending on that small emotional handout social media gives out in the form of attention. And that is unsettling, because a person who does not ask to be validated breaks a game that almost everyone else accepted without even noticing. In this video, you are going to understand the psychology of people who do not post their photos on social media from a much deeper place than simple appearance. We are going to explore the relationship between identity, self-esteem, intimacy, and power, following a perspective that Stoicism has been refining for more than 2,000 years with a clarity that still feels uncomfortably relevant. And when we reach the end, you may discover that the real mystery is not why some people do not show themselves, but why so many need to in order to feel like somebody. I'm Gabriel, and this is the Stoic Garden. Stay until the end because we are going to walk through 5 keys that not only explain this behavior, but also reveal a much more serious truth about how personal worth is built in silence. And the last one could completely change the way you see people who no longer post their photos on any social network. There is a kind of silence that does not come from sadness or fear, but from exhaustion, with turning your own life into a display window. Many people do not post their photos because one day they discovered something that takes others years to accept. Privacy is not a flaw that needs fixing, but a territory that deserves protection. While half the world runs around trying to prove it is living, they step away from the noise and choose not to turn every moment into visual proof of their existence. And that brings us to the first key in this journey: silence as refuge, not as lack. Digital culture has made reserve seem suspicious. If you do not show yourself, the automatic interpretations appear immediately: that you have low self-esteem, that you do not feel like enough, that you must be hiding something. It is strange because no one stops to think that maybe hiding is not always the right word. Sometimes there is nothing to hide. Some things are simply not up for auction. Some people have understood that showing everything can also be a way of impoverishing who you are, because what is overexposed eventually loses depth, mystery, and even value. What is private, when handled with judgment, stops being absence and becomes inner presence. Seneca, who knew quite a bit about the fragility of the human ego, left behind a line that still hits with uncomfortable clarity. We often regret having spoken, but rarely regret having stayed silent with prudence. And this was not said by some ascetic cut off from the world, but by a man who knew power, pressure, and the gaze of others up close. There is deep wisdom in that, because posting a photo is not always an innocent act. Very often it is a silent negotiation with the need to be seen. Choosing not to do it, on the other hand, can be a sign that someone no longer wants to hand over their peace to the unstable reactions of other people. What is most interesting is that this kind of person often makes others uncomfortable precisely because they break a collective expectation. Today, everyone is expected to document their body, their food, their travels, their partner, their sadness disguised as a smile, and even their supposedly spontaneous moments, perfectly edited. Anyone who refuses to play along seems to step outside the invisible contract, and when someone steps outside the contract, questions arise. Why do they not need to show themselves? What do they know that others do not? What happens when a person stops using their image as an emotional passport? That discomfort says less about the one who stays silent and more about a society that no longer knows how to exist without putting itself on display. Very often, the absence of photos is not a rejection of identity, but a stronger way of inhabiting it. The person who does not expose themselves may be telling themselves something very simple and at the same time very rare in this age. I do not need to turn my face into content to remember who I am. There is a strange kind of strength in that, a maturity that does not usually make noise, because the person who lives obsessed with public reflection ends up fragmented. They adapt their expression to the algorithm, to approval, to whatever look is profitable. But the person who keeps parts of themselves outside other people's gaze preserves a cleaner center, less invaded, less tamed by the spectacle. Of course, it is not always about strength. Sometimes there are wounds too, disappointments, emotional exhaustion, a desire to disappear a little from the human noise. But even there is something that deserves to be understood with more respect. Not every retreat is defeat. Not every withdrawal is inner poverty. Sometimes a person stops showing themselves because they are rebuilding far from the circus, far from quick judgment, far from that collective anxiety to seem happy all the time. And honestly, in an age that rewards empty exposure so heavily, stepping away from the display window for a while may not be the worst idea in the world. The problem is that many people cannot bear that possibility, because if they accepted that someone can live without putting themselves on display, they would have to ask why they themselves need to do it so often. And that question is no longer so comfortable. That is why this silence is so often misunderstood, not because it is confusing in itself, but because it works like a mirror. An uncomfortable mirror, yes, but an accurate one. It reveals that there are still people who keep a boundary between their life and other people's consumption. And these days, keeping a boundary is already a form of power. Now let us move into the second key point of this video. Understanding that external validation should not govern your self-esteem, something 95% of people still do not understand. Most people do not post a photo just to save a memory. They post to prove something, to measure something, to feel something. Sometimes they want to confirm that they are still attractive, relevant, desirable, or at least visible in the middle of an ocean of faces, competing for a few seconds of attention. So when someone decides not to take part in that exchange, they are not just changing a behavior. They are changing their relationship to personal worth. Social media has perfected a dangerous logic, making people confuse being watched with being important. Every reaction becomes a small dose of confirmation. Every kind comment works like a brief painkiller. Every lack of response, on the other hand, feels like a small narcissistic wound. And so, almost without noticing, self-esteem ends up outsourced. It no longer rests on conscience, character, or the coherence of real life, but on the fluctuating response of a distracted audience that celebrates you today and forgets your name tomorrow. Very solid, obviously. That is why there is something psychologically strong about someone who stops posting their photos, or simply does not feel the urge to do it. Not because they think they are superior or above everyone else, but because they have begun to break the association between being seen and having value, and that changes a lot. When self-esteem stops feeding on immediate applause, a less flashy but much more serious process begins, the construction of a more stable inner perception. You depend less on how others see you because you start looking at yourself through different criteria. And that shift, small as it may seem, changes the way a person loves, decides, relates, and respects themselves. Ralph Waldo Emerson, deeply influenced by Stoic ethics, wrote that nothing can bring peace to a person but themselves when they choose to remain faithful to their own inner law. And that is the point. People who do not need to expose themselves in order to feel real usually have begun to recover that inner law. Maybe not perfectly, maybe with contradictions, but they have already taken a step many are afraid to take. They have stopped asking the outside world for an identity that should come from within, because as long as you need constant confirmation, your peace will always be rented. This also explains why so many people read that attitude as coldness, distance, or even arrogance. When someone does not seek approval in the usual way, it unsettles people. It looks like they are not playing, not cooperating with the collective ritual of self-exposure. And that is uncomfortable because it reveals a dependency that others still do not want to face in themselves. What happens when a person no longer feels the need to keep announcing themselves all the time? What happens when they stop turning their image into a silent request for recognition? Something happens that many find hard to accept. They begin to become freer. That freedom does not mean despising beauty, photography, or the legitimate desire to share a moment. The problem is not posting. The problem is needing to post in order to stay emotionally afloat. That is where the tool stops serving you and starts ruling you. And the more it rules you, the more vulnerable you become. Because then an ignored selfie can ruin your afternoon, a comparison can poison your mood, and someone else's success can make you feel like your life is worth less. All because you handed your center over to a public square, where no one is really thinking about you as much as you imagine. When a person stops living under that wheel, something reorganizes inside them. They begin choosing more carefully what they share and what they do not. They become less impulsive, less needy, less anxious to create an impression. And then a kind of dignity appears that does not make much noise, but it shows. Not the theatrical dignity of someone who poses as if nothing matters, but the dignity of someone who finally understood that self-respect cannot depend on a screen. And that shift, even when it is not visible, is often the beginning of a much deeper transformation. There are people who do not post their photos, not because they are ashamed of themselves, but because they have learned not to turn everything valuable into material for consumption. And that difference changes the whole interpretation. Because hiding out of fear is one thing, and holding yourself back out of judgment is something entirely different. In an age when almost everything is displayed just to confirm that it exists, protecting what is intimate has become a strange gesture, almost subversive. And that brings us to the third key in this video: intimacy as the highest form of power. What is intimate has value precisely because it is not within everyone's reach. Not every connection deserves to enter your memories. Not every gaze deserves access to your face, your home, your body, your happy moments or your wounds. But digital culture has pushed the opposite idea. The more you share, the more authentic you are, as if authenticity needed witnesses, as if an emotion were not real until it was posted, as if a sunset alone with yourself were worth less because it did not end up in a 15-second story. And then we wonder why so many people feel empty. Personal reserve, when it comes from awareness and not from trauma, is a form of sovereignty. It means you still decide which parts of you belong to the world and which do not. It means not everything is for sale, not even emotionally. Epictetus, the freed slave who taught philosophy as an art of living, left behind an idea that fits here with almost brutal precision. Do not explain your philosophy, embody it in your actions, and let your conduct be your argument. That is what many of these people do without saying it. They do not announce their worth, decorate it, or upload it with a filter. They live it. And that kind of presence is often far stronger than any loud display. What is more, protected intimacy creates a different relationship with yourself. When you do not feel obligated to expose every moment, you begin to live it more deeply. You are no longer in the scene wondering how it will look from the outside, but what it truly means from within. How many people today no longer know how to enjoy something without first imagining how to post it? How many can no longer even tell the difference between living an experience and producing a version of that experience for others to consume? That is where intimacy stops being a simple preference and becomes a defense of the soul against the constant invasion of other people's gaze. That is why people who do not post their photos often preserve something many others have been losing: a boundary. And having healthy boundaries does not make you inaccessible. It makes you whole. It means not just anyone gets in, not just anyone gets to interpret, and not just anyone gets to comment on what you are still building. There is a quiet dignity in that. The dignity of someone who does not feel the need to open every door just because the world has become addicted to walking in without permission. And yes, of course, there will always be people who call it mystery, coldness, or posturing. People tend to give strange names to anything they cannot easily consume. Ironically, that reserve sometimes creates more respect than constant exposure. Not because secrecy is a trick, but because what is scarce still carries weight. What is not handed over immediately demands a different kind of relationship, less superficial, less automatic, less vulgar. And here something important appears. Keeping parts of your life to yourself is not denying connection with others. It is requiring that connection to have enough depth to deserve access. That is not arrogance, that is emotional maturity. If this video is already making you look at social media, your image, and your own intimacy with more clarity, subscribe and leave a like. Because what comes next will show why this reserve not only says something about the person practicing it, but also about everything it stirs up in others. And write in the comments the phrase, "My worth does not need approval," along with the country you are listening from, to make it clear that there are still people who understand that dignity does not need a storefront. Stay with me because the final part will not just wrap up this topic, it is going to completely rearrange it. When a person decides not to fully enter the game of showing themselves, they are not just making a personal choice, they are also disrupting a collective dynamic. Because social media does not function only as a set of individual display windows, but as a system of constant comparison where everyone watches and is watched at the same time. Anyone who stops offering themselves up to that logic breaks an expectation that others had already accepted as normal. And that leads us to the fourth lesson in this journey. What makes others uncomfortable about people who do not put themselves on display? The discomfort begins, first, with the impossibility of classifying them. People feel calmer when they know where to place others. The one who posts a lot seems needy. The one who shows off trips seems successful. The one who posts their relationship seems in love. The one who shows their body seems self-assured. These are quick, shallow, often absurd readings, but they keep the illusion of control in place. By contrast, the person who does not post their photos leaves too many blank spaces. They are not easy to read. They do not hand over enough material to be consumed, measured, or compared. And that irritates people because a mind used to labeling gets nervous when it cannot fill out the file. Then another deeper discomfort appears. The person who does not put themselves on display interrupts the emotional economy of comparison. Seneca warned that comparing our fortune to that of others makes us forget the blessings we already have and multiplies unnecessary desires. That happens every day on social media, even though now they call it entertainment, connection, or inspiration to make it sound nicer. We look at faces, bodies, routines, relationships, achievements, and measure our lives against that crooked yardstick. But when someone steps out of that circulation or takes part without exposing their image, they become a strange piece inside the mechanism. They no longer offer a clear mirror for others to compare themselves to, nor a visual trophy to be envied, nor a convenient reference point to feed the silent competition. That is why automatic suspicions often appear. If they do not show themselves, something must be wrong. If they do not post photos, they must have a problem. If they do not share their face, maybe they do not feel like enough. It is a clumsy way of defending the system, but a very common one, because accepting that someone can live without putting themselves on display would force many people to examine the need with which they themselves do expose their lives. And that kind of self-examination is not always pleasant. It is much easier to pathologize someone else's reserve than to confront your own dependence on public reflection. Much more comfortable to say the other person has an issue than to ask yourself why disappearing from the display window for a few days makes you so anxious. It also makes people uncomfortable because those who do not show themselves keep a measure of power over their own narrative. On social media, exposure makes you accessible, but it also makes you interpretable. People observe you, project onto you, mentally edit you, use you as a surface for comparison or fantasy. When you do not hand over so much material, you reduce that margin of invasion, and that disrupts a deeply rooted habit. The feeling that we have the right to know, to see, to deduce, and to comment on other people's lives as if they were public property. What really bothers people about someone who does not post their photos, that they still belong to themselves, that they do not let themselves be fully possessed by other people's gaze, that they keep an area beyond the reach of easy judgment. There is also an almost ironic detail here. In a culture saturated with exposure, reserve creates curiosity. Not because it is a strategy of seduction, but because what is not available draws attention. What is not so easily at hand seems to have more depth. What is not given away immediately demands a different kind of approach. And that is especially uncomfortable for people who have grown used to instant access, instant opinions, instant conclusions. The person who does not put themselves on display cuts off that flow. They impose a distance. They force others to recognize that not everything is there to be consumed in seconds. And for an age addicted to immediacy, that almost feels like insolence. But perhaps the deepest discomfort is this. A person who does not turn their image into a spectacle makes it obvious that there is another way to exist in the digital world. A way that is less anxious, less available, less obedient to the command to be seen in order to exist. And when someone embodies a different possibility, they expose everyone else's automatic behavior. They do not need to criticize, give speeches, or declare themselves superior. Their mere way of being already questions something, and sometimes that alone is enough to irritate those who are still trapped in the need to be seen in order to feel real. After everything we have covered, one possibility still remains, and it is almost always overlooked. Not posting photos is not always the result of a strategy, an insecurity, or a simple personal preference. Sometimes, it is the natural consequence of a deeper transformation. The person no longer needs to use their image as a bridge to recognition. They no longer turn their face into a silent request for confirmation. And that brings us to the fifth and final key of this video, the real reason some people no longer need to show themselves. There comes a point in certain inner processes when you start getting tired of maintaining an identity for other people's consumption. It is exhausting to perform, exhausting to edit yourself, exhausting to live with one part of your mind constantly asking how what you are barely trying to live on the inside will look from the outside. Then something shifts, not in some dramatic way, not with a mystical awakening you can later post with sad music in the background, but with a steadier kind of clarity. You realize your image does not need to keep working to buy you attention. And when that happens, exposure stops feeling necessary. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor forced to live under everyone's gaze, wrote something that should dismantle more than one modern obsession. Soon you will have forgotten everything, and soon everyone will have forgotten you. So act rightly now without expecting any lasting reward. There is a fierce freedom in that idea. Because once you accept the fragility of applause and the fleeting nature of attention, you stop organizing your identity around the impact you make. You no longer feel such urgency to be seen. You are no longer consumed by the need to remain in other people's minds. At last, you begin to live with more truth and less performance. That does not mean becoming invisible to the world, locking yourself inside a false sense of superiority, or looking down on people who do share their lives. It means something more serious. You have stopped depending psychologically on the display window. The difference is subtle but enormous. One person can post a photo and still be free. Another can go weeks without posting anything and still be enslaved by what others think. The real point was never the isolated behavior, but the inner bond with the need to be validated. And when that bond breaks, exposure stops being emotional nourishment. It becomes optional, and what is optional no longer rules you. That is why, in many cases, the person who does not post their photos is not hiding from others. They are returning to themselves. They are no longer treating their image as a form of currency. They are withdrawing their value from the public market, where it used to be priced according to reactions, desire, or other people's curiosity. Is that not, at its core, a form of maturity? Is that not a sign that something has been put back in order inside? Maybe that is why this attitude is so often misunderstood, because it forces people to face an uncomfortable truth. Many do not post to share who they are, but to check whether they still matter. And that is where the final reframing of this whole subject appears. The psychology of people who do not post their photos on social media cannot be reduced to shyness, trauma, or something strange. Sometimes what is really there is a quiet refusal to keep turning one's existence into a request for recognition, a decision to stop living outward all the time, a way of reclaiming dignity in a culture that has confused visibility with value, access with closeness, and exposure with authenticity. And when someone makes that move, even if they never say it, even if they never explain it, even if they do not even think of it in those terms, something in their presence changes. Because in the end, true strength is not in getting everyone to look at you, but in no longer needing that to feel whole. Not in building a flawless image for other people's consumption, but in inhabiting yourself with enough peace that you do not offer your whole being to every gaze. Not in disappearing out of resentment, but in consciously choosing which parts of you deserve to be shared and which should remain your own. And when a person reaches that point, they no longer post or stop posting from a place of lack. They do it from somewhere else, from a place many still do not understand, precisely because they have not yet learned how to exist without witnesses. If you have made it this far, you now know something most people still avoid. Not everyone who puts themselves on display is secure in themselves, and not everyone who keeps themselves private is broken inside. It takes far more clarity to hold on to your own way of seeing in the middle of a culture that pushes everyone to show themselves, compare themselves, and beg for attention with an elegant appearance. Many will remain trapped in that cycle, confusing visibility with value and reaction with self-worth. But you have now seen the problem up close. What remains is an inner decision. Keep participating in that game without questioning it, or start relating to yourself from a place of greater dignity. Hearing this means very little if tomorrow you hand yourself back over to the same mechanism without awareness. What matters begins after the video, when you look at yourself honestly and ask how much of what you share comes from freedom and how much comes from need. That is why I want you to write it in the comments as a stand you are taking, not as an automatic gesture. Write the phrase, "My self-worth does not need other people's approval," and add the country you are listening from. Let it be more than just another phrase. Let it be a visible declaration that you understood dignity does not depend on the display window. I'm Gabriel, and this is the Stoic Garden. This channel exists because there needs to be a place where clarity matters more than appearance, where we do not come to lull the ego to sleep with pretty phrases, but to look directly at what controls us and reclaim our center. This is not just about understanding behaviors, it is about awakening a different way of living, with more judgment, more inner mastery, and less dependence on other people's gaze. And if you feel this message could shake someone else awake, share it. Sometimes a single honest idea can crack open years of automatic living. Subscribe and become part of this community if you are also choosing to live with more depth and less need for approval. And keep going with the next videos, because this is not an isolated topic. It is only a doorway into something bigger, into a freer way of thinking about your identity, your relationships, and your inner peace. What you understood today does not end here. It is only beginning to show you everything you can stop asking from the outside so you can start building it within.